Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Ruben Langbroek, and I'm Head of Asia Pacific at GRESB. We're still waiting for some people to dial in, but in the next 45 minutes, we're going to make climate and transition risk a key priority for you. Today, I'm joined by my dear colleague, Christina Jambaska, who is our in-house expert on this very important topic. And Christina will offer a deep understanding of climate risk and more specifically transition risk, as well as its relevance to the Asian real estate sector. After Christina's presentation, we'll have an amazing panel of experts, and they will discuss the practical challenges and benefits of climate and transition risk management, both for real estate companies and for investors. And I'll introduce our distinguished panelists later on. Then in our last section of today, Christina will be back with a bang and present our solution on how to identify transition risk within your real estate portfolios. She'll also explain the benefits of our unique transition risk report and how that can help you in terms of identifying and managing climate-related risks. I can see that there's more people joining us also. Welcome to today's webinar. Before we begin and dive in, some very simple housekeeping rules. You can post any questions you may have via the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And of course, also, if you have any questions for the speakers, then please post them and we'll try to cover them during the different sections. Further, know that today's webinar will be recorded and we will send you the link afterwards, so you can share it with your colleagues or your kids or perhaps the neighbors next door. You also receive a sample of our transition risk report to give you a better idea of the solutions it brings to many different companies and organizations, for example, like yours. And of course, any feedback you may have is most welcome. I believe that's all from me now. I can see that there's lots of people dialing in at this moment. So I think it's the perfect time to hand the mic to Christina. Take it away, Christina.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ruben, for the introduction. My name is Christina Jambaska, and I am a senior associate on the real estate team at GRESB. In the next couple of minutes, I would like to provide you with some context on the topic of today, making transition risk a priority for real estate in Asia. So to start it off, what is climate risk? In broad terms, this is the potential for climate change to adversely impact human and ecological systems. It can be broken down into two main categories that closely interplay with each other. This is physical and transition risk. When we think about physical risk, we think about the direct impact that climate change can have. So think about the impacts of floods, tropical storms, droughts, or heat waves. They can materialize by destroying property values, reducing the insurability of assets, disrupting businesses, or demand for real estate in locations that are severely impacted by either acute or chronic physical risks. Now, on the other side, we have transition risks. These refer to risks that arise from policy, legal, technology, and market challenges as the global economy transitions to net zero. So, for example, transition risk could result from government policies that limit the use of fossil fuels, imposition of carbon taxes, emission trading systems, and tightened environmental regulations overall. You can see that also on the graph here that there is a relationship between the two. If we decarbonize the economy, which we hopefully will, but we do so in an abrupt way and without the necessary preparation and delivery, transition risks are going to increase. On the other hand, if we fail to do so, this is going to lead to greater physical risks and also impacts to businesses and financial institutions. Asia as a region is exposed to both types of climate risk, given its geographical features, but also its diverse socioeconomic circumstances. On the physical risk side, we can see that the region is facing increasing frequency and severity of storms, flooding, heat waves. But at the same time, Asia accounts for an increasing share of global greenhouse gas emissions, which also puts a lot of pressure on the region to tackle transition risk. Although the historical emissions coming from the region were historically low, they have been growing faster than the global average. And according to recent studies, by 2040, under a 1.5 degree scenario, Asia is expected to already exceed its global carbon budget unless rapid decarbonization is underway. Now, diving deeper into transition risk, those risks, as I mentioned, are business-related risks that arise from the societal and economic shifts towards a low-carbon future. Those include policy, legal and regulatory, reputational, market, and technological risks. All those categories are interconnected and often are on top of mind of investors, as each of them to some extent can create financial and operational consequences to asset value. Given the high carbon intensity of the real estate sector, it is particularly exposed to transition risk. And in different regions, those different categories that I just listed have a varying level of impact. For example, in Asia, perhaps reputational and market risks are not yet on top of minds for investors and fund managers. Whereas in Europe, we see a strong push even from tenants for demand for less carbon intensive buildings. Additionally, policy and regulatory risks seem to be the ones that are the easiest to contextualize and then to put into context, as they often result in higher cost of operations for real estate, and are also more easily relatable across regions. Of course, even then, the impact of different regulations tends to be local rather than global. So the extent to which transition risk can be materialized and can impact different properties would also depend on the specific circumstances of their location. Now, diving deeper into real estate specifically and transition risk, we know that the sector is very carbon intensive. It's responsible for 40% of the global CO2 emissions. What we also know is that this exposure to transition risk is going to result in a growing risk of stranded assets. Stranded assets means assets that are going to devalue prematurely or ahead of time. Especially in the context of transition risk, this would mean that the value of the asset has been reduced due to a higher cost of operations. This is also going to result in a higher risk of write-downs, as well as overall increased market vulnerability. Now, all of this can be managed and it can be put under control. And there are many different tools that real estate fund managers and investors have to utilize in the transition to a low carbon economy. Now, if we think about real estate, the core of the problem really lies in the energy use and the energy intensity of buildings. And to be able to do that, real estate managers should look into retrofitting their buildings, installing more on-site renewable energy, thinking about holistic strategies across their portfolio to be able to reduce energy consumption but decarbonize the assets overall. Now, all of this is very easily said, especially for me sitting here in Amsterdam, but the reality on the ground, I can imagine, can be very different. The operations or the amount of capital that has to go into refurbishing or retrofitting assets and thinking about reducing carbon risk at its core can be very, very cost intensive. And they have to be timed and they have to be priced accordingly, and more importantly, they have to be prioritized. And to be able to prioritize those, a tool that the real estate industry has is the Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor, or CRREM. It started as a European consortium of members that aimed to deliver decarbonization pathways for the real estate industry. Initially focused on Europe, but then expanded globally to also cover the US, Australia, Asia. The main aim of the Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor is to increase transparency and alignment within the real estate industry of how transition risks are being monitored and assessed. It provides a standardized and science-based methodology that aims to support global harmonization of decarbonization activities. It also creates higher awareness of transition risk within the industry, within the real estate industry, by providing the right tools for fund managers and investors to be able to communicate in simple terms and be able to understand the transition risk within the portfolio. It also supports real estate investors and asset managers in actually measuring and reducing their operational carbon footprint at the property and portfolio level, with new tools and new scientific recommendations being developed on an ongoing basis. With that, I would like to hand it over back to Ruben to have our great panel discussion. Thank you, Ruben.
Excellent. Thank you, Christina. It was a great crash course in transition risk. And I'm sure that our online attendees get a much better understanding of the concept as well as the relevance of climate and transition risk, especially within the Asian real estate context. Indeed, we're also very interested to understand how all of this theory works in practice. which is why our esteemed panel of experts will be offering some very valuable insights into their approach. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce today's panelists. From Singapore, we have Penger Fu, Vice President Sustainability at CapitaLand. Then from Hong Kong, we have John Wade joining us, Senior Responsible Investment Manager at APG. And last but certainly not least, also from Hong Kong, Calvin Kwan, Director of Sustainability and Risk Governance at Link REIT. So welcome all and thank you for joining us today. We have limited time, so let's dive straight away into the conversation. And perhaps starting with Penger. Great to see you again, albeit online. Obviously, as we heard, transition risk and decarbonization are strongly intertwined. And especially decarbonization is a huge challenge, not just in general, but specifically for the real estate sector. What are some of the strategies that CapitaLand is deploying to tackle this challenge? Can you give some, let's say, real-life examples?
Thanks, Ruben. As you said, as time is short, maybe I will go straight into the transition risk. I'm sure everybody understands the carbon mitigation hierarchy, and the priority is always on energy efficiency for real estate on-site, renewable power and purchase of green power, and last mile, it would be the offsets piece. So the way we look at it is we have already implemented an internal carbon price for CapitaLand since 2021. So for all new investments that will come into our assets, we will deploy an internal carbon price that we have established for all investments. So they will review what is the gap between the new asset versus our 2030 target. And then we deploy it as an internal carbon price so that management can see what is additionally needed, what CAPEX is needed to make sure it is future resilient. Secondly, I think when it comes to regulations and expectations, we make sure our targets are science-based targets initiative, SBTi validated. So we have Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 targets that are validated. Although our Scope 3, we are going to review this. As for customers, I think, and when it comes to regulations and investors, we are also mindful that our data must be audited, and we have done so since 2010. So I think as for the rest, suffice to say, the challenge in meeting customers is green lease engagement. And when it comes to procuring electricity, as a group, we are able to look at it at a country level, to be able for Singapore, for Asia, to look at it and aggregate and as best as possible, try and purchase at a group level to achieve the most cost-effective option. So with that, I'll pause for this moment, Ruben.
That's great. Thank you, Penger. Calvin, perhaps interesting to ask you the same and also perhaps reflect on some of the elements that Penger mentioned. Does it align with Link REIT's approach to decarbonize or to set, let's say, verified net zero targets?
Yeah, Ruben, thanks for that. I would have to say that what Penger has already mentioned, absolutely agree. I think she and I share a lot of thoughts and ideas and bounce thoughts and ideas quite often as well. I think for Link, I can summarize our efforts really into three buckets, right? The first one's going to be the internal decarbonization initiatives, and this is the ongoing energy savings measures that we're doing. We've saved 40%. We've reduced our electricity consumption by 40%. Absolute since 2010, and we continue to make progress on this. One of our strategies is the net zero by 2035 strategy, and that's going to be quite interesting on how we achieve this over the next few years. Modernization of facilities is going to be quite important, especially as we upgrade and enhance our properties across Hong Kong, mainland China, Singapore. The second area that we focus on is really the community and stakeholder partnership approach. And I've kind of hinted at this. We reach out to peers, CapitaLand, we reach out to our investors, John, APG, and so forth, to get insights into what we should be looking at. One of the key things that we understand is that we cannot achieve decarbonization by ourselves, and that we have to work with each other in terms of learning from each other and building on experiences that other people have already done. One of the biggest challenges for Hong Kong listed companies in terms of reporting emissions is actually Scope 3 emissions, because a lot of places we actually don't have this data where other jurisdictions do. And that requires us to work with our tenants to figure out have them report some of their information, have them tell us how we might be able to help them with some of the energy efficiency measures as well. And that's really the partnership side. From a regional perspective, we work with peers across the APAC region to hopefully set best practices and standards for this area as well. The last area, which is the most important, and Penger said the same thing, is really about the transparent communications with investors. How do we know that we are providing not just information that we have targets, but more importantly, the progress that we're making, and some of the challenges that we come up with as well. Because investors are actually a very good source of information and ideas for us to make further improvements, because they have the insight from other clients, which can help us improve as well. So likewise, I'll pause there and then turn the time back over to you.
Excellent, thank you very much. John, as an investor in real estate and not a small one either, how are climate-related risks integrated into your, let's say, risk management or investment practices currently? And perhaps also to reflect on what Kelvin just said, do you see or do you find sufficient transparency and perhaps standardization across your investments in terms of the key metrics or information that you typically would need to assess?
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Ruben. Very happy to be here today to share some of our perspectives from APG. If I talk firstly around how we deal with new investments, when we are screening any new investments, we will look at both the physical and the transition risk. I'll speak mainly about transition today because I think that's what everybody else has covered. But obviously, we'll come back to physical at some point. But from a transition risk perspective, if we're looking at sort of two things really. We're looking at one, the process and the strategy that the business is taking towards managing transition risk. So we're looking at the governance around transition risk. Who's responsible for it? Is there a policy? Is there an internal price of carbon? Those kind of things. But we're also very much focused at the asset level. So, if we're looking at a selection of seed assets, perhaps for a private market investment, we would be asking, okay, so what was the historical energy use for those buildings for the last 3 years? Or if they're new buildings, what is the forecast demand? And then we would take those figures and assess them against the CRREM pathways. Typically, we would do that ourselves. Often, more and more now, we're seeing more and more managers, they've already done that. They already know what they're striving to work towards with the CRREM pathways. So we'd be looking at that from both the carbon and the energy perspective. Yeah. So for us, that's very, very key. We want to make sure that we're purchasing or investing in buildings that have got at least 15 years of time below the pathway. Not always easy, plenty of challenges, which I'm sure we'll discuss at length today. But as an approach, that's what we try to do for new investments. And then for existing investments, we typically annually will do a portfolio screen. So we're trying to, at the moment, we're still in the process, or we have a process for collecting the data. And to kind of lead into your second question about sort of transparency and access to data, that's one of the things that we are battling with, partly because of the size. We have around about 100,000 real estate assets under our investment. So obviously we're working with pretty large data sets. We're working across hundreds of different managers. So getting that data can be a challenge. I think we're at about 70% of our portfolio is covered at the moment in terms of that data. So obviously we're looking to grow that further. But yeah, so to answer your question around transparency, that's the key thing, right? We're really looking now for individual asset level data, because as much as portfolio level information is useful, when we're looking at, say, an average stranding year, for instance, for a portfolio, that's of course interesting, but actually what we really want to know is which buildings are above the pathway, which ones are below, what are the actions being taken, or what are the actions that are going to be taken going forward to bring those assets underneath the pathway.
Great, thank you. The devil is always in the detail. Perhaps back to Kelvin, in terms of potentially stranded assets, as just mentioned by John, you talked about modernization of assets, probably green retrofits or refurbishments. In your experience, are those, let's say, viable and also financially viable climate resilience strategies? Can you provide some examples, perhaps?
Well, I think so. When we look at the points on stranded assets, our focus right now is going to be about what might our carbon efficiency or intensity be for a building? What is it now? What might building standards be later on? And will we be able to meet those particular building standards? So a lot of our effort right now has been focused on the macro perspective in managing energy, making sure the chillers are efficient, replacing LED lights and so forth. Those are things that are easy to do and straightforward. What we're finding out is that now we need to start figuring out how we do the micromanagement of energy, essentially knowing how equipment is turning on and off, correlating this with footfall, understanding how this changes with weather patterns and so forth, really the granular details. And from that, we've run a couple of pilots, and we've actually found that there's at least a further 5 to 7% energy reductions that we can achieve from that. So that gives a good idea of what else is remaining from the micro scale perspective. But that also means that we still have a large kind of residual carbon footprint left over, and this is something that we're still trying to figure out what to do. I think that frankly we're trying to figure out what lifetime we would set for stranding, and then from that work backwards to see, okay, what technologies might be improving, what regulations might be changing, how do we make sure our buildings are going to be essentially future fit. Frankly, it's still work in progress, but that's why it's important for us to work with other developers, other real estate peers and investors to find out what the best practices might be.
Right. So collaborative work in progress. That's great to hear. Penger, perhaps you can provide some examples of, let's say, green retrofits or modernization of assets, as Calvin mentioned as well, for CapitaLand.
Hi, thanks, Ruben. Maybe I could, before I could share that, I think one of the challenges we have is that, first of all, it would be easier to install really efficient equipment into new build. But we all know we have existing buildings, and if we were just to demolish them and rebuild it, you have another problem of embodied carbon. You have another problem of financial and tenants and what you're going to do about that. So that is a real challenge. So when we look at retrofitting, we are exactly like Kelvin. We have deep dived into the micro level, all the low-hanging fruits, the chiller efficiencies, whatever we have. The challenge we have is the chiller is not at the end of life, EOL. There is at least 10 more years to go. I mean, consultants will come and say there is a super efficient one now, but we ask ourselves, there is embodied carbon. Second, what are we doing about it is we decided as the parent to ring fence a special sustainability fund and innovation fund, 50% for sustainability. And we will, through a governance process, put in global call decarbonization pilots to test at our buildings. So we have existing buildings which are already at the Green Mark Platinum level. But we know that based on CREM or based on new regulations, it needs to even be better. But I cannot further tweak my energy efficiency. If I do that, I will compromise my commitment for indoor air quality. I will spend a lot of effort on all the special lighting to have a COVID happy, and safe environment. That we will not compromise. But what else can I optimize? So we are testing and we have seen certain results. And it is exactly like what Calvin said. It's a very micro level. And we have been testing in Singapore, testing in China, and testing in US, anything and everything to help in the decarbonization process. So I thought just to give you a hint of that. For existing buildings, we also have assets in Singapore. If you come to Singapore, you know Clarke Quay. Clarke Quay is a conservation site. I cannot install solar panels on the roof, which is conservation. It's conserved. But what I have and recently announced is in the asset enhancement, 1/3 of our budget is to spend on the cover and the natural airflow, and it will help reduce the temperature by 2 degrees and improve the air quality. And in the current physical risk of heat, right? We still want to push for al fresco style, but we are trying every technology as far as possible. And it's a third. It is a third of our AEI cost. So I just want to give that as an example and ongoing challenges that we sometimes really have to struggle really hard. Thanks, Ruben.
the struggle is real, but great to see still those very many different initiatives, and not just in Singapore, where of course there's a bit of a microcosmos, but even in very different markets such as China. So thank you for that, Penger. We heard the word regulation a couple of times. Obviously, with many of the Asian governments and policymakers having committed to get to net zero by 2050, we can expect more rigorous regulations. Perhaps back to John, what is your view on regulations? Will that help the industry move faster and get to, let's say, the right outcomes and transition to net zero faster, or you reckon it might be a hurdle perhaps even?
Yeah, I mean, I think without changing regulations, we're only going to be able to go so far. And we have to recognise that, pretty much everyone on this call is probably coming at things pretty much from a commercial angle. And, we're certainly having conversations with managers at the moment where we're saying, how far can you push, the building design, and right. Balancing, pushing the building design past, way past local building regulations, but without compromising commercial returns is a huge challenge, of course. And I think what we need to see, or I'd like to see, at a country level, I mean, it'd be great to see at a sort of a pan-Asia level, but I think that's probably asking for too much. But at an individual country level, I'd love to see governments set real roadmaps for how the building regulations will improve. So not just saying, oh yeah, by 2050 we're going to be net zero, but these are the steps of which we're going to slowly make the building regulations more, more rigorous, tougher, etc. Because that then gives the industry time to catch up. It gives the industry time to think about how to meet those targets. Because I think without that kind of roadmap, it's very, very hard for the industry to keep going. And like Penger and Calvin have said, you hit a limit at what you can physically do. And I think once you set ambitious targets, then you hope the industry can start to innovate and start to do other things to get there.
Yeah, no, that's clear, and I fully agree that you have to have a certain ambition also as a government to set the right direction. Perhaps a question just came in from one of our online attendees. So can we perhaps Penger and Kelvin as well, for Singapore and Hong Kong, give some examples of what the government is currently doing and how they are supporting the industry? Starting with you.
Thanks, Ruben. Yeah, so actually I wanted to highlight, I just want to share, Singapore government is actually knows its constraints in Singapore. So if I can highlight a challenge on decarbonization, is Singapore as a market. I'll share Singapore from the CapitaLand perspective. We have solar panels on more than 20 properties in Singapore. Quite a large number of them are industrial properties, very flat, can attract as much. And there may be a perception that we are going to be able to, generate a lot of renewable power. It's not true, okay? I can't even. So what I want to highlight is Singapore can't generate enough green power to power our buildings. The government is working very hard to create an ASEAN grid for the import of green power, because the three key levers to decarbonize a building really is energy efficiency, renewable energy. Of course, we use green certification. So I just want to set the context and constraints of Singapore. But Singapore government is trying, and we are following that. Second, thanks, Kelvin. Yes, the green certification for Singapore is not just platinum. They are going for super low energy. We actually have one asset that could achieve that. It's only industrial property. And that's really for the constraint I've already highlighted. We will not compromise on delivery to our tenant, but I cannot get green power. I can't install solar panel because it's highly cloudy, highly built up. But I think what we want to say is the standard has increased, and the green rating in Singapore is aligned to GRESB actually, and to CREM. But a final comment on CREM, I know there's a lot of use, but do people realize there is no CREM pathway for India, for Thailand, for Vietnam in certain public models? So it is not as easy to apply for Asia as it may be for Europe, but nonetheless, we are trying our best. So I thought I'll just give that as a practical insight for market. Back to you.
Excellent. Thank you. I have one final question, and then unfortunately our time is up. We heard that our sector in general in Asia will need to decarbonize faster, also to prevent these transition risks that we've been talking about. For each of you, I just want to hear a yay or a nay. Will we make it? Will we decarbonize fast enough? Again, starting with you, Penger.
I'm trying to be optimistic. Yay.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. How about you, Kelvin?
We must. So the answer has to be a yes.
I like it. John?
As Penger went one way, Calvin sat neatly in the middle. Yeah, I mean, I think it's unlikely we're going to hit the 1.5 degree target. I think everyone in this space has kind of made their peace with that. But I'm hopeful that the ambition that we see in Asia will at least sort of limit the impacts as much as we can. So yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic.
That's great. That's great. And again, it's clear that it's a collective effort. So thank you for your effort as well to provide those insights. Truly fascinating. And I'm sure that our online attendees will take that back to their own organization to see what they can do to decarbonize, but also to manage transition risk within their portfolios. Thank you very much. Indeed, as
Thank you so much, Ruben, and thank you so much to our panelists. In the next couple of minutes, I would like to demonstrate to you GRESB's transition risk report solution that would hopefully turn everybody's nay into a yay, and maybe John's quietly cautious yay into a more optimistic one. So to start off, the GRESB's transition risk report helps participants and investors to obtain insights into which are the assets that are most exposed to climate-related transition risk and how this might affect their real estate portfolio over time. The transition risk report is solely based on information that real estate participants provide to us as part of the real estate assessment every year, and it's being generated using all of the asset level data that is being reported in the current year. Behind that, or at least we already heard from Calvin and the rest of the panelists, data continues to be an issue and it continues to be a problem within our industry. And when we talk about transition risk, we cannot do that only for the buildings where we know what's in there and we know what's happening. These also in general tend to be the newer buildings or the buildings that are equipped with the proper data monitoring systems that allow us to get insights into their performance. When we talk about transition risk, we really need to see what's the rest of the picture, not only the ones that are the well-performing ones that are equipped with those systems, but also the entire portfolio. For that, using our data set of more than 1,500,000 buildings, and even that year it's going to be probably around 20% more than this, GRESB has developed a very detailed and very granular estimation model to try to fill in those missing gaps in the data. And John, definitely I hear you working with large data sets. It's never easy, especially as we worked on over the development of the estimation model. But through that, I believe that we are now able to provide through the transition risk report our participants with more granular and more detailed insights on their portfolio's performance for the part of the portfolio that they actually cannot see. Now, what we do to generate the transition risk report is we collect all of the data as part of the real estate assessment, which is, of course, quality checked and is subject to automatic outlier checks and other data quality procedures. Then we identify the gaps in the portfolio, and then we fill those in at the very granular asset level, or where it's even possible at the subspace level, so separately for common areas and for tenant spaces. We clean that up, we compare this against the CRREM decarbonization pathways for each specific property, and then we aggregate this up into the transition risk report. The overall result is that the transition risk report provides a high-level understanding of the transition risk within a portfolio, as well as the detailed breakdown of how each asset performs. We have a view of the portfolio, so what is the overall big picture of the portfolio's transition risk, but then also broken down deeper into country-level insights and per property subtype, as well as an overview of each individual asset within the portfolio. The benefits of the transition risk report are that we heard from our panelists what are the things that you can do once you have identified transition risk. And they're doing some great things, such as setting internal carbon pricing and then doing massive strides to reduce electricity and then even finding the nitty-gritty details of how they can continue to do so. But the first step in doing all of this is to actually be able to understand the transition risk in your portfolio and be able to have that high-level assessment. So what we do is we provide easy access to that to our participants without having them go through any additional extra burden of collecting additional information or having to go through the manual process of assessing those risks themselves. We use asset level data that's already been collected in the GRESB assessment. We combine that with real data from our data set so that we can make sure that estimations of missing data are done as accurately as possible, while of course still the priority should be on continuing to collect actual data. We then provide an indication of the portfolio's transition risk and help prioritize decarbonization efforts by finding those hotspots in the portfolio where urgent care is needed first. In the end, what the report represents is also what GRESB represents, which is an engagement platform between our real estate participants and investor members so that they can speak the same language. And we heard already about the challenges behind getting access to the data, understanding asset level information, but also the granularity and the detail behind the CRREM pathways that is needed to actually provide an accurate picture of portfolio's transition risk. All of that are complex problems that are going to get resolved over time, but the first step indeed is the collaborative work in progress that Ruben mentioned. And this is exactly what the transition risk report aims to do. Now, to highlight a little bit more about what are the next steps for the transition risk report, we are going to launch the updated version of the report in October, so a couple of weeks from now. And of course, apart from updating the report with the newest data set out of the 2023 GRESB real estate assessment, we have also made some improvements to our methodology and the functionalities that the report is going to offer. So some of them include refinement of our aggregation methodologies to consider the percentage of ownership of individual buildings in the overall portfolio view. We are also going to provide portfolio level benchmarking insights, not only against the CRREM pathways, but also against the GRESB universe. We are also going to provide insights on market-based emissions. Something that we've heard quite often is that location-based emissions can only go so far as to demonstrate what are the efforts that real estate fund managers are taking to take steps towards decarbonization. So that should help them illustrate to investors better the holistic view of decarbonization that they're taking. We are also going to allow for a request of the asset level of Excel download of the asset level data to then be able to allow fund managers to do deeper analysis and be able to look further into the data. And finally, we're also the transition risk report presents a view of the portfolio's performance in a do-nothing scenario, where we use the data from the previous year to then be able to project that and monitor how that is going to impact into the future. Something that we often hear from participants is that on top of this, they are already having strategies in place. They have set up targets, they have set up improvement plans, but those are not going to materialize over a year. So something that we want to incorporate to be able to facilitate a better communication of the overall plans that a portfolio has to decarbonize would be to also allow participants to comment on their results and then be able to add that additional context for investors. With that, I would like to hand it over back to Ruben to see if we have any questions from the audience.
That's great. Thank you, Christina. Obviously, as we've heard from the panel from Christina, there's quite a bit of challenges to overcome transition risk and climate change and decarbonization. But it also shows that we have a very useful solution to help you identify potential transition risk within your portfolio, and indeed to truly make climate and transition risk a key priority. We received a couple of additional questions from the online attendees. One was in particular in relation to CRREM and the decarbonization pathways. We already heard from Penger that some of the pathways might be a bit difficult to apply them to specific economies or jurisdictions. But also know that APG has quite a bit of experience in terms of using CRREM within a portfolio, as already alluded to by John. John, can you perhaps dive a bit more into how APG is using those pathways, and perhaps also what your engagement with your investment managers looks like if those pathways indeed, let's say, highlight a potential risk of stranded assets?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Ruben. I mean, as I mentioned before, when we're working with managers, we are looking to understand where either existing assets or future assets sit against the pathways. To kind of comment really on certainly Penga's statement as well around the challenges that Singapore faces and other markets in Asia face, I think they're very fair, and certainly I think the majority of people's views tend to look at the CREM pathways from a carbon perspective, quite rightly, but also the CREM pathways also have their own energy pathways. So what we the sort of the view that we take is that we obviously would like to see assets that are below both pathways, but we recognise in certain countries, Hong Kong in particular, that has got a very dirty grid. That actually, if you look at just the just the carbon pathway, it is very, very challenging to meet, and certainly very challenging to meet in the future. We can see assets complying now, but the future scenarios are much more challenging. So we prefer in those instances to take a view on energy, because my perspective with energy, it's very easy to measure. We can get bills, so it's very easy to prove where the energies come from, and therefore it's very easy to demonstrate performance against the pathways. So yeah, in those instances where it is difficult to meet the carbon one, then we tend to take a view around energy, and I think that's where we need to go really, because ultimately we don't want the real estate industry to shrug their shoulders and say, oh well, we've done whatever we can, we'll just wait for the government to decarbonize, because if we wait for governments to decarbonize the grid, in most of the jurisdictions that we're working with within Asia Pacific, that will not happen in time.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think that's the final question that we received. As mentioned, we will follow up with more information on specifically our transition risk report. But as always, all good things come to an end, and so does this webinar. So I'd like to thank all speakers as well as all online attendees for joining us today. And of course, at GRESB, we do hope that these insights will support you in developing your climate risk strategies and identifying potentially stranded assets in terms of transition risk. So I would say, let's go and tackle climate and transition risk right now. Thank you very much. My name is Ruben Langbroek, and I wish you a great day. Bye-bye.